So, once that was kind of behind us, I asked JD, just give me some homework. Like, tell me some books to read. Because that's how I get into things.
Yeah.
And the first thing he did was to flatter me. And he told me he consulted Tim Keller for advice on my case. Which it was very savvy of him, because I was like, oh, these two fancy guys are so interested in compiling this bibliography for me. I better take this seriously. So he set me to work on N.T. Wright's giant book on the Resurrection of the Son of God, Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Also, I had read some Tim Keller, just kind of as reading him, from the point of view of a scholar, but hadn't really engaged with his apologetic work. And so I read Reason for God and spent the next few months. It felt like doing another master's degree. I was just obsessed. I still am. I don't really read anything else yet. I'm still sort of constantly, reading apologetics and trying to get myself up to speed and all the kind of spiritual questions that I feel I'm behind on. But I'm not really a diary keeper. I'm not that interested in like my own thoughts. But I found that I had to start keeping a very intense journal, mainly as a way of synthesizing and processing the conclusions I was sort of reluctantly coming to, and finding, especially finding N.T. Wright's account. This is a very detailed, many of your listeners have probably read it, but it's like 800 pages. It's a very intense, like in the weeds study of pagan and Second Temple Jewish milieus, seeking to explain what the idea of resurrection did and did not mean to the immediate predecessors of the first Christians, and like what's the intellectual cultural landscape in which these people were drawing. And he argues that coming back from the dead is not something that dead messiahs did at this time, when there were lots of self-nominated saviors running around, and certainly it's not something that Jesus's followers would have expected. And he argues that if we had only the empty tomb or only Jesus' appearances by themselves in the historical record, that would not, have yielded this early Christian belief in the risen Messiah, but that there are all these reasons to take very seriously the combination of those two, and that the resurrection becomes this very reasonable explanation for their belief. And he persuaded me that attempts by people he calls kind of post-Enlightenment scholars to mythologize these stories, to read them as later Christian beliefs, imposed on the past, to say that the witnesses in the Gospels engaged in wish fulfillment, based on dreams or special feelings they had about their experience with Jesus, that all of this is really what C.S. Lewis would have called chronological snobbery. And it doesn't take seriously the sophisticated way in which first century Middle Eastern people navigated their world and their worldviews. And I felt really personally indicted as a historian. I had always thought of myself as very committed to taking historical subjects seriously. Like, this is the whole reason I do this for a living, that I believe that these people, we're not superior to them. But reading N.T. Wright made me realize that I had been engaging in a certain degree of chronological snobbery, and I was reading him and kind of believing biblical scholars alongside the very skeptical end of New Testament studies, really trying to put those, two clashing approaches to the mystery of the resurrection in conversation. And I was increasingly perceiving among the more skeptical scholars, a posture toward historical subjects that troubled me. And I became persuaded. Richard Bauckham's book was very helpful. Later on, I read Craig Blomberg's big book on the historical reliability of the New Testament, which was really helpful for me. So I was just sort of writing all of this down, also reading a lot of cosmology. So kind of trying to get at this from a couple angles, focusing on the historical claims of the Gospels, but also the big questions, like, is there even a God? And probably the most important book I read on that front was Francis Collins's book, The Language of God, which made a huge impression on me, partly because he very effectively lays out some of the arguments for, a theistic interpretation of the Big Bang and the fine-tuning of the universe and so forth. But really, it's the autobiographical portion of that book that hit home for me. I, of course, knew about Francis Collins, but I had always assumed that he grew up in a Christian home. And when I read that, in fact, he did not, that he converted as an adult at medical school here in Chapel Hill at UNC. He was living on my street, when this happened. That made me, I had no choice but to hear him and read him differently. I would say that if you had asked me, a year ago, like, what's your worldview? I had for some time at that point been committed to saying, well, I'm a pragmatist, and my intellectual hero is William James, and he's still one of my intellectual heroes. So that is, I thought of myself, I still like to think of myself as someone committed in a sincere way to engaging with new evidence, and I don't possess the truth. Truth is this asymptote that we can never fully get to, but we can get better and better at approximating it. The more information about our world we assimilate, and so I found myself kind of creeping toward this point where I was going to be more than 51% persuaded that the Christian account of the resurrection is the best answer we have. But I couldn't believe that a person could convert just by reading a lot of books and going through a lot of footnotes. So this whole time I was praying. I would have these, conversations with JD, occasional Zoom calls with Tim Keller, who was super helpful. And they were like a great counterpoint. So, JD is a classic Baptist. So probably every third conversation would end with like a personal altar call. If Jesus showed up right here, what would you say to him, Molly? Whereas Tim's approach is like very different, So I remember in our first conversation, at the end of it, I told him my whole story, and he was like, Molly, I don't know what's going to happen. You might just stall out again. I don't know if you'll become a Christian. Like, I almost wonder if he was using reverse psychology, but they were very...
A studied nonchalance.
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing I was continuing to do was worship at Summit. Now, this is a big deal because you have to understand, my whole adult life, I've been a giant high church snob. Like, you can't exaggerate. You cannot exaggerate how snobby a high church person I always was. And I was always certain that was the flavor of Christian I would be if I ever managed to become a Christian. But I see now, and I'll, when I look back at Apostles of Reason, like, for the most part, I think it's a pretty empathetic book, and that is not, I know Al found it snarky. I think for the most part it's really not snarky, but there are some exceptions to that, and one is the couple of pages in which I describe seeker-sensitive megachurch worship, which is not a sympathetic passage of the book. So here I found myself sort of inexplicably drawn to worship at it's Summit. The mothership in North Raleigh, because there's many campuses, the mothership is like the platonic ideal of a suburban, Southern Baptist megachurch. And it's freaking awesome. I think for me, well, there's a few things going on here. One is I realize that for a person like me who's a historian, there's a way in which the liturgical experience of high Anglo-Catholic worship gives the mind so many things to do that aren't Jesus. So my previous experience of church, this sounds ridiculous to say, but I do think this is accurate. My previous experience of church was just I wasn't thinking about Jesus. Like, I was thinking about Thomas Cranmer and what a genius he was, and the Book of Common Prayer and the poetry and the stained glass windows and all of that. And there's a way in which megachurch worship, the very simple kind of theologically to the point hymnody, the intense 40-minute sermon deep dive. It helped me focus on what I needed to be focusing on. Also, the sort of giant anonymizing context of the megachurch was exactly what I needed. It was this perfect combination of anonymity. Like I could go, it's dark, it's so loud, you can't even hear yourself singing. No one knows who you are, except that I was becoming friends with the pastor. So when I could work up the nerve, which was not every time, I could go down front afterwards and like check in with him. So it was sort of this combination of friendship and anonymity on my terms. And I should say too that the crucial intervention that JD made for me intellectually, that made it possible for me to even have this process, was to help me see that I had in my previous efforts, half-baked as they were, to investigate Christianity, I'd allowed myself to be overwhelmed by things that weren't the central thing. So if you're looking at converting to Christianity from the outside as a fully formed adult, you're not doing it in the context of a family, it's a lot to take at once, right? So there's all the Jesus stuff, but there's lots of crazy stuff in the Bible. There's all the end times, prophecies, heaven and hell, the sexual ethic that is so at odds with everything our current culture says. It's so much at once. It is overwhelming. And you might begin to make baby steps on one point, but then you're like, oh man, but all that other stuff is so bananas. How I can't do this. I'm paralyzed. What JD helped me see was that it stands or falls on the resurrection. And I could agree to struggle with all the other questions. Like they're important for sure, but they're not the main thing. I could agree to struggle with them, and that it's all about Romans 10:9, right? I mean, it's all about confessing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believing in your heart that he rose from the dead. And I could do that because I'm a historian, and it turns out, and here again, I feel so, I guess every conversion is a series of epiphanies. Once you've had the epiphany, you're like, how could I have ever been so dumb, right? So this is in that category. Here I am, a historian of Christianity, like certainly not a first century specialist, but yeah, a historian of Christianity. And I had always conceived of myself as unusually open to the claims of Christianity, sincerely open. But I only realized in this process last summer that I really had not been, and that I had never, there were all these resources for seriously investigating the claims of this religion, which is unique in that it makes this singular historical claim, and that is everything. And there are the tools available to really engage with it and make up your mind about it. And I had never done that. And I felt kind of ashamed of myself. And so, over those months, I was praying for some sort of, warm and fuzzy mystical intervention, and it didn't happen. I just got to the point in August where I thought, well, gosh, if I am a consistent pragmatist, I have to admit that I have gotten over that line of the resurrection being the best explanation for the historical evidence we have. And if that's true, I have to change my working hypothesis of the universe.